Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carl Jacobs from OpenUp in South Africa, and today the session is called Anti-Corruption, Collaboration and Capacity, How African Civil Society is Advancing Pro-Democracy Innovation. Just a brief, I'm not sure what's going on with the slides, but just a brief overview. We're going to look at the shrinking space in civic space in Africa. What does it take to build digital democracy in Africa? A multi-pronged strategy called Empower, Innovate, and Connect. And then we're going to look at two case studies. So the first one's CAN, which is a large-scale training event we did, and then also TAF, which was an anti-corruption incubator. And then finally, we'll look at how we can use these types of projects and how do we scale them to lay the groundwork for something like the Digital Democracy Initiative. So the problem, a shrinking civic space in Africa. I'm really hoping this is not how all the slides look. Essentially, I think we don't have to look very far to understand that democratic backsliding is happening. Essentially, this refers to democratic institutions and norms and practices being eroded. This refers to weakened checks and balances, also erosion of our civil liberties, disempowerment of electoral services, as well as the centralization of power. The link to Africa specifically, I think, I'm not sure what's going on. The slides don't seem, there we go. So when you look at this map, it's unfortunate that a lot of the text is missing, but essentially democracies are under pressure worldwide. That box did say that this has been happening for 18 years. And this map kind of illustrates that, where the purple countries are countries considered to be democratically not free, and the yellow ones being partly free. And the particular issue for Africa is that we face these challenges of, we have heavy donor reliance, but that's been shrinking, especially in terms of international support. There's also been a lot of digital exclusion that still exists on the African continent. I think there's still lots of people without access to the internet or no access at all. There's also a lot of legal and political pressure where civil society organizations are being targeted through surveillance, shutdowns, or restrictive laws. And there's also a big skills gap where even if there's a will to do something, maybe the groups don't have the technical expertise or the digital tools to scale that civic engagement. And this obviously leads to a trust deficit, so low public trust in institutions and limited civic participation. And I think the second map illustrates quite nicely that it shows that the civic space is closing. And you can see that quote on the map there, that 80% of Africans live in countries where the civic space is either obstructed, repressed, or closed. And there is quite a nice overlay between the countries where democratic freedom does not exist and those where the civic space is closing. So this brings us to the question of, what does it take to build digital democracy in Africa? I think we can break this down into two questions. The first one is, how do we build this strong, lasting civic tech capacity in Africa? But also a point that was brought up in this morning session is, what lessons from the past can we scale to support this democracy digitally? And just a little quote from our CEO that always helps us ground things is that civic tech is only as strong as the ecosystem around it that supports it. And this moves us over to OpenUp's approach. We have a multi-pronged strategy called Empower, Innovate, and Connect. The first part is about the money. This is where the financial resourcing comes in. So this could refer to tiered funding structures, co-funding structures, even referral to other funding structures, and also simple things like helping organizations with subscriptions to digital tools. The Innovate is about skill building and support. So what type of skill building workshops are we doing? Are they hackathons? Are they incubators? As well as one-on-one help desks where people can come for support. And then finally, we have Connect, which is all about networking, as well as shouting about the work that you're doing. So this could include local participant networking, so you can have your participants in your actual interventions networking with each other, much like we're all doing today and tomorrow. There's also the broader ecosystem networking, so this is beyond just the initial event itself. How do we keep those connections going? And then amplification, which is where you want to shout about the work that you're doing. If you are doing good impact work, make sure that you're sharing that on your website, through newsletters, perhaps social media, and this then creates cross-network support. Yeah, this is going to be a big problem. So unfortunately, the slides are not formatted in the way that I would like them to be, but bear with me. So this was a project, this is the large-scale training we did, the CAN Capacity Accelerator Network. The objective here, I'll just speak to it, is that we had over 200 participants from 20 African countries. And the idea was to bring together all these different people and build data skills to then eventually build a network of statisticians, academics, media, civil society organizations. And in terms of that framework that I showed you earlier, empower who provided the funds. In this instance, it was the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, where along with the United Nations Foundation. The Innovate section, the text would have been up there, but I'll just tell you about it. What skills building and support occurred? We had a 3-month data science training course. It had modules on both data wrangling basics, so this is data cleaning, transformation, analysis. We also then had more advanced data wrangling, so Python, pandas, machine learning, as well as some data visualization and communication techniques, so building dashboards to explore this data. This was followed by a 6-month fellowship program where 10 projects from that initial training were taken then and selected, and they were provided with 6 months of support, particularly on health and climate data. And this was done through WhatsApp groups where they could ask questions, get one-on-one support, and then also a Notion-based help desk. And then finally, the in-person training event, which happened in Ghana, actually just completed last week. This was then a space for those 10 projects to come and show us what they had done. They got some feedback, but more importantly, we were trying to show them how to do storytelling using the data that they had just learned about. And finally, the connect element, which is on the end there. This was all about how do we get it out there, what kind of networking. And I think the nature of the initiative itself was very collaborative. The activities were structured in a way to get people out of their comfort zones, speak to people they haven't spoken to before, and allow for that idea exchange. And I think we also then had dedicated networking sessions where people could exchange information beyond just the event itself. And then I also would say that the WhatsApp groups essentially created a virtual space of the same idea where people could share these ideas beyond just the event themselves. Sure, this is really hurting me, these slides. Key successes and challenges, I'm just going to speak to them. Just three. I think the main success with the large-scale training is that people were highly engaged from the get-go, which is a very big win if you have 200 participants. There was also a very broad range of modules and workshops, as I touched on earlier, and then there was also a central course curriculum. So I think before participants even signed up for the initiative, they could have a full understanding of what they were signing up for, which was a really good success. I think in terms of challenges, there was a broad range of topics, and this obviously means that topics are touched on quite in a shallow manner, but that's always a toss-up between going narrow and deep or broad and shallow. I think another challenge is that there was a big lack of geographic diversity in the facilitating team. So OpenUp, we're from South Africa with colleagues based in Cape Town and Johannesburg. But when you are teaching over 200 people from 20 other countries, it would have helped if we had facilitators from those countries. And of course, with 200 people, you do have a relatively high dropout rate towards the end. Okay, this is the second one, so let me just try to get everything on here. I'm really sorry about these slides. This was the anti-corruption incubator. The objective here was also similar to impart data skills training, but this time to government institutions and those that work with government institutions. And this was to try and build projects or prototypes that they could go back into their own organizations and implement to tackle corruption issues. It was 35 participants from various organizations, and their projects were selected on the relevance and the real-world impact that their prototypes could have. In terms of who provided the funds, it was enhancing accountability, funded by the European Union. We had a 3-day in-person hackathon where we had hands-on training, skills transfer, refining the problem statements, and beginning to shape those prototypes. This was followed then by 2 technical webinars where we built on those skills, particularly around data cleaning, which is a big issue, and then also the legal compliance around data, particularly personal information in South Africa. And then we had regular project check-ins, so those are those help desks where people could come and ask one-on-one questions, and we provide them with the support to develop their prototypes further. And then finally, we did have a 2-day in-person learning event where they got to showcase these projects, get a little bit more technical feedback, and then also plan for the future. So how did they go from incubating these ideas to actually implementing them? And again, I think the nature of these events are structured in a way that there is meaningful connection, people can exchange ideas, and really reflect on the broader anti-corruption landscape in South Africa. And I think an example would be that the organizations really realized that they were working on similar, even sometimes the same kind of corruption issues, and it really opened up their minds to this idea that we can share ideas and knowledge and resources, not only to tackle our individual goals, but the shared anti-corruption goals. I don't know why it's not. Oh, there we go. These are the key successes, of course. You can read the ones at the bottom, but the ones I wanted to highlight are unfortunately in white. So key successes, strong collaboration. Again, there was a very robust culture of collaboration which emerged early on. The data projects were also very viable in the sense that the teams had independently developed them. We gave them the data skills, but they came up with the ideas themselves. And 5 of these prototypes were then carried forward and went into a more showcase kind of thing. And I think another very key success is that the projects were diverse and complex in terms of the corruption they were trying to address. And I think this really meant, it was because they were drawing on the participants' actual experience of corruption from these various organizations. And so it really had this real world impact to it that they could take these ideas back to their organizations and hopefully implement them. And the last thing there was just a quote from a particular, oh no, sorry, we need to do challenges. Limited access to usable data. Corruption data is very sensitive. I think a lot of the teams weren't able to access up-to-date corruption data, and this did restrain the prototypes a little bit. Obviously, governments are quite bureaucratic. Those that were working with or in government, they faced resistance, delays, a lot of red tape, and this also hindered them from accessing both data, but also implementing that into their organizations. And it's been said before, but government IT policies are also quite strict. A lot of government departments in South Africa are completely locked into Microsoft and they block anything else. And so that means that any other tool that they could potentially use to motivate for a particular project internally just fell flat because they couldn't show it with the tools available to them. And hopefully these come out. Yeah, okay. So these are just some examples of the tools that were developed. So in this case, Active Citizens Movement, they developed this tool called KleptoCalc. And essentially what it was trying to do was show the social cost of corruption. So you could go in there and put in a certain amount of money that had been involved in a corruption case, and it would spit out that that money could have been used to buy so many hospital beds, as an example. The second one was by PSC and IJR, and they developed the Ethics Integrity Management System. And this was a dashboard to then explore and visualize cases of misconduct within government where, for example, if someone was accused of a particular case of misconduct, what happens is that the government employee will resign before they can be charged with something, and then they suddenly appear in another department and get hired again before anyone can actually hold them accountable. And then finally, My Vote Counts. They developed this dashboard called Whose Vote Counts, and it helped to explore the data around political party funding in South Africa, where a lot of our political parties are privately funded. So you can actually trace the money and see who's influencing which political parties in the country. And so what's needed to scale this type of work? I hate to break it to you, but we're going to have another blank slide. So let me just run through this. There's essentially 5 what I would call preconditions for scaling up. You need a deep contextual understanding and user-centric design. So you really want to have a comprehensive understanding of your target groups. So you can do this through user research, surveys, interviews, and co-creation workshops. You also want to make sure that your development processes are user-driven. So make sure you're getting constant feedback from your beneficiaries, and you want to make sure that you have prototypes and support mechanisms to react to those. And I think you also want to be flexible in your delivery methods. You want to offer hybrid online, offline support. You might even want to use analog tools, so things like posters or flip charts, especially for those kinds of organizations that have limited access to digital technologies. You also want to be robust, accessible, and diversified in your support mechanisms. So I mentioned there's the financial support mechanisms. So look at all those different types of funding, tiered structures, co-funding, referrals, as well as subscriptions to digital tools. And then there's also the non-funding support mechanisms, so capacity building, workshops, skill building, hackathons, incubators, and then the support help desks that I mentioned. And I think also another important element to mention here is that you can also help organizations through helping them manage their internal organizations. So starting to introduce them to things like agile methodologies. And I think you also want to make sure that your application and reporting processes are quite simplified, particularly for grassroots organizations that maybe don't have the means to access the applications via digital tools. Another precondition for scaling up, I would say, is strong collaborative ecosystems and networks. So make sure you form consortiums and have strategic partnerships. You want to spread the risk, you want to access larger funding pools, and you also want to leverage diverse organizational strengths. There's also an element of active community building. So you want to make sure you're using newsletters, WhatsApp groups, annual events that foster the networking amongst your beneficiaries and your participants as well into the broader ecosystem. And then you want to have a centralized platform where you can gather all of that knowledge and keep it going beyond just the initial event. There's also strategic and proactive sustainability planning. So diversify your funding approach. You need to balance your grant income with your project revenue and also explore other avenues such as private philanthropy. We can also look at cost optimization, so using lean operations, so open source software, low cost software, and this also really helps for the sustainability of projects beyond the initial event. And then be proactive also in your engagement with funders. I think you want to do regular impact reporting, you want to have pitching events, you also want to make sure that you're targeting advocacy notes, and this will help attract some sustained investment beyond the initial project. Another precondition for scaling up, adaptive project management and continuous learning. So again, implement those agile methodologies. This really allows for flexibility and responsiveness to emerging needs and challenges. Make sure you have an integrated monitoring system. I think it's crucial for tracking progress, disaggregating your data, and informing the implementation adjustments that you might need. And then I think finally, you also want to have that clear and consistent communication and knowledge sharing. So documentation, handbooks, tailored learning materials, make sure that these are disseminated not only in the initiatives, but also beyond the initiative into the broader ecosystem. And this is, okay, well, these are pitfalls to avoid. I think what you really want to avoid is misjudging a local capacities and context. Never assume that everyone has a uniform understanding of concepts. I think also it's imperative that you don't ignore the digital divide. It's a reality, and that there are also very real realities of unequal access. Avoid also ignoring cultural differences and language barriers. And I think you would also want to make sure that another pitfall to avoid is inadequate support and engagement design. So avoid overly complex applications and reporting processes, as I mentioned. Make sure that your co-creation is not siloed. So when you are designing activities for participants, make sure that those activities make them get out of their comfort zone, that things can be as cross-functional and collaborative as possible. And then I think this is a big important one, is that you want to avoid insufficient time for group work. I think we also put a lot of effort on presenting, but I do think that where the real collaboration happens is the group work, and the group work does take time. Another pitfall to avoid is unsustainable financial and organizational models. So don't over-rely on project-specific grants. Make sure that you have funding coming from other streams. Don't assume that the productization is the universal solution. And also make sure that you aren't under-investing in business development. I think it's important to always make sure you're checking for new opportunities and ways for money to come in. And then finally, make sure that you don't have a weak project or ecosystem management. So don't underestimate the effort it requires to get people together in a room, and make sure that you're not avoiding those low-cost or open-source solutions. And once again, finally, I think it's really important to adapt agile management practices. And that brings me to the final slide. Yeah. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.